Sergey Viktorovich, we are witnesses and participants of tectonic shifts in the global world order, and naturally, this brings about shocks. In your view, is the most dangerous phase already behind us? You know, that is for astrologers and political scientists. We, after all, are people engaged in practical diplomacy and practical foreign policy. We prefer not to make predictions, but rather to concentrate every day on solving today's tasks, because it is from these bricks that the future will be built. A future that will inevitably be multipolar and polycentric, and will, in fact, progress and develop according to the templates that are now, and not only now, but for a fairly long time, being formed in relations between, say, the Russian Federation and the members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the People's Republic of China, and in a broader context within structures where Russia and China are actively present, meaning BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Back in 1997, the Russian-Chinese Declaration on a Multipolar World Order was adopted, and it laid down the basic principles that should underpin relations between states. Nothing revolutionary, but a confirmation of the principles of the UN Charter: equality, non-interference in internal affairs, mutual respect, mutual benefit. That is, what is enshrined in the UN Charter, but has never been fulfilled by the West. And Russia and China, well, if you will, spearheaded such a movement in favor of establishing the foundations of a multipolar world. Every time the President of the Russian Federation and the President of the PRC hold meetings, the final documents necessarily reflect this theme. And just now, when President Putin's visit to the PRC took place in May of this year, a declaration was adopted on the formation of a multipolar world order and international relations of a new type. This is another significant step forward in conceptualizing what is happening and in consolidating approaches that will consolidate what has been achieved and prevent artificially slowing down, let alone undermining, the process of forming a polycentric world order. And attempts to slow this process down, at the very least, they do not stop. Our Western colleagues, both the United States and the European Union and NATO, of course, are engaged in this. Even under Biden, yes, even under Biden, this already manifested itself quite openly. The United States forgot about all the principles of globalization that they had promoted for many decades after the Second World War. This refers to the encouragement of free market forces, ensuring fair and honest competition, ensuring the inviolability of property and much more. The complete freedom that ensured precisely the global character of economic processes. When all of this was discarded by the United States, not only to punish Russia in quotes after the start of the special military operation, but also to restrain the economic development of our country and other competitors of the US and the West, primarily, of course, the People's Republic of China. As soon as all these principles were turned from a standard of freedom into, or were replaced by, sanctions that undermined the reputation of the dollar, undermined the reputation of the euro, and generally undermined all the principles of the World Trade Organization itself, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it became clear that the world economy would fragment, which is exactly what it is doing now. The real actions of the West are actively simply forcing us to look for such forms of relations with our partners, both in terms of financial settlements, in terms of economic principles, and in terms of logistics and trade routes, that would not depend on the West. I remember perfectly well how the United States, when it was moving away from the gold standard peg of the dollar, when the dollar went into a free float, loudly declared to the whole world that nobody should worry. The dollar is not the property of the United States. We cannot abuse our position as the country where the reserve world currency is printed, the main reserve world currency. This is not our property. It is a common good, the property of all mankind. Well, and then, when these processes of introducing unscrupulous methods into economic relations began, all of this was rejected, forgotten, and now, when Donald Trump was still running for a second term, he harshly criticized Biden for using the dollar as a tool for sanctions, and said straight out that these actions of Sleepy Joe were undermining the reputation of the American currency. As soon as Donald Trump was elected president, he immediately began doing similar things when he accused BRICS of abandoning the dollar and switching to other currencies, primarily the national currencies of the BRICS member countries. President Putin has said more than once in this regard that it was not us who abandoned the dollar. It was the West that tried to use it. The US first and foremost tried to use the dollar to gain unfair advantages. So the era is interesting. It will precisely be, I have no doubt, a fairly long era. And we will do everything at each specific stage every day in our practical work to defend our interests on a wide variety of fronts, starting with the financial, economic, transport and technological ones, and of course on the front of the special military operation, because a great deal will depend on this. And I have no doubt that achieving the goals of the special military operation will ensure a significant strengthening of our positions on the international arena. We were just talking about the multipolar world and its structure, but Washington still sees itself as such a hegemon that can decide where there will be war and where there will be peace. And if you look at how the military actions in Iran were justified, as opposed to that messianic promotion of democracy around the world, they decided to justify the strike on Iran using the Old Testament, using religious interpretations, and this was done at a fairly high level. Pete Hegseth spoke about this too. In your view, is this an attempt to replace secular international law with divine providence? Well, there is such a movement in the United States that not only declares itself Christian, but promotes a very specific interpretation of Christian commandments and Christian values in close intertwining with Zionism and Judaism. And therefore, I would not take seriously the words of certain figures in the current administration about the Old Testament justifying the actions of the United States. This is such a dubious interpretation, but it seems to me that it is unserious for politicians to say such things. It can mean only one thing, that no other arguments to explain their actions are left. Actions that did not call forth support anywhere, including in the United States themselves. But Iran, yes, President Trump at a certain stage said that we will destroy Iran as a civilization. That is a rather steep swing, but the fact that this is a declaration of an unachievable goal leaves no doubt in anyone's mind. Now they demand, the Americans, that Iran must give up the idea of possessing nuclear weapons and must open the Strait of Hormuz. Before the unprovoked US-Israeli aggression began on February 28th, the Strait of Hormuz operated for freely for everyone, and no one experienced any problems. Before the start of this aggression, a fatwa of the supreme leader was in force in Iran, who was then eliminated through a political assassination, Ayatollah Khamenei, prohibiting the possession of nuclear weapons. The IAEA regularly confirmed the absence of signs that the Iranian nuclear program, the energy one, was being diverted to military needs. Iran's entire nuclear program was under the control of the IAEA. Everything that is now being demanded of Iran, all of this, existed before this aggression began. And it is not for nothing that the United States clearly, judging by their statements and actions, understands and experiences discomfort from this situation, and they do not know how to get out of it. Well, of course, they are primarily the ones to answer, but we in every possible way support the dialogue that, for better or worse, is going on between Washington and Tehran through the mediation of the Pakistanis. The Saudis and Egyptians are also striving to provide assistance, and it is very important that this dialogue nevertheless continues, and the agreement that will be reached must take into account the interests of Iran and its neighboring countries. We consider it important to promote dialogue between the Arab monarchies and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are ready to facilitate this. We have a security concept. For the Persian Gulf, we updated it recently and sent it to the 6 countries of the Cooperation Council for the Arab states of the Gulf and to Tehran. We will stimulate dialogue, but of course, to begin with, it is necessary to completely exclude any military methods in the future. It is interesting that the very same people who were negotiating with Iran before the start of military actions, the very same people who promised that the dialogue would be continued, are now conducting a dialogue with us. Such episodic meetings with Witkoff and Kushner are essentially our entire dialogue with Washington right now. Does the fact that the people conducting the dialogue with us are responsible in America for practically all the wars in the world worsen this whole situation at all? We are not against each country determining for itself who its chief negotiator will be and how many agendas this negotiator will cover. The main thing is that what you talk about and what you agree upon is fulfilled. On August 15th of this year, it will be a year since the summit in Alaska took place, where upon consideration of the American proposals on Ukraine, the Russian leadership accepted these proposals. And since then, we have observed no progress, no desire to convince Ukraine to accept these American proposals. All of Biden's sanctions continue to be extended, no change. And plus, the sanctions of the Donald Trump administration have been added, Lukoil, Rosneft, and many other things. The Pentagon, without hiding it, supports not just the purchase of American weapons by Europeans for Ukraine. The Pentagon supports joint programs with the Ukrainians to develop various types of weapons. An item is included in the Pentagon's budget along this direction to provide security assistance to Ukraine for the period up to 29. That is, this is no longer a Biden legacy. This is a decision of the current administration. And when our American colleagues, including the 2 negotiators mentioned by you, tell us, well, if only we could get rid of this Ukraine problem, which we inherited, and we will have such joint mutually beneficial projects, well, Ukraine needs to be settled. We proceed from the fact that from our point of view in Anchorage in August of last year, Ukraine was settled, as far as it depends on the Russian Federation. The proposal of the United States was accepted. They acted as a mediator, but for some reason, when one country accepted their mediation proposal, they somehow cooled down to this process and exerted no pressure on Ukraine. Moreover, they themselves turned out to be under very strong pressure from their European allies. Trump declares that Ukraine will not be in NATO, but NATO Secretary General Rutte yesterday or the day before yesterday in Kyiv declared that Ukraine will be a member of NATO. That is, you see, Europe wants to prove that it is the one that will call the tune, that it will not give up its support for the Nazi regime. It is to this regime that Europe promises security guarantees when the hostilities end. A regime that banned the Russian language, banned the canonical Ukrainian church, contrary to all international norms, including the UN Charter, numerous conventions, yes, and including the Constitution of Ukraine itself. They passed laws that violate the constitution. No one says anything to them on this topic yet. When just here yesterday I was reading, the new Prime Minister of Hungary, Mr. Magyar, said that he announced that they had agreed with the Ukrainians on restoring the rights of the Hungarian national minority in Ukraine. And now, they say, now Hungary can lift its ban on starting negotiations with Kyiv on Ukraine's accession to the European Union. That is, look, this means only one thing, that even Hungary, which understands the problem of national minorities that exists in Ukraine, lifts this barrier, and the European Commission is ready to start negotiations. They want to start these negotiation processes with the Ukrainians almost this week or next week, paying no attention to the grossest violations of the UN Charter and the Convention on the Rights of National Minorities. That is, the Russophobic subtext of this entire action with dragging Ukraine into the European Union is not even hidden. Therefore, regarding the negotiators, the President has said more than once, "We are always open to negotiations. We will always be ready to listen." But our position, which we consolidated according to the American proposal in Anchorage, remains unchanged. The main thing is that this position is promoted responsibly by the authors of the initiative themselves. But I was surprised by the last thing that I want to say regarding mediation and negotiators. Marco Rubio spoke in Congress yesterday, the day before yesterday, I think, and there he said that the US cannot be a mediator because they support Ukraine, including with weapons supplies. The circle has closed, it turns out. And does such a complex dialogue get hindered by the absence of an American ambassador in Moscow under the president? This is an American decision. Any country has the right to determine the level of its diplomatic representation in foreign countries, and if it is convenient for them this way, well, of course, full normalization should probably include a full-fledged head of a diplomatic mission. An ambassador is meant. But we offered a lot to the Americans so that relations would be more normal than those Trump inherited from Biden. In particular, back at the meeting with Marco Rubio in Riyadh in February of 25, I proposed, let's, as a first step, cancel sanctions against parliamentarians, against ours and the American ones, because right now practically all of them are under sanctions, ours under American ones, the Americans under ours. No reaction. I reminded them a couple of times there is no reaction to this. There is no reaction either to our call to return the diplomatic property illegally seized back by Obama before Donald Trump's first presidential term. There is no reaction to the hints, let's settle Ukraine, then it will be easier to move in all directions. And here, again, the settlement of Ukraine was discussed and accepted by us in the American edition in August of 2025 in Alaska. That is a closed circle, and so we walk along this circle. Therefore, we appreciate that the negotiators, Messrs. Witkoff and Kushner, feel very good sentiments toward our country, as far as we can judge by their statements, that they are sincerely interested in these relations normalizing. But the interests have not materialized into anything yet. But is there no feeling that Donald Trump is using that well-known madman theory that Nixon and Reagan once used? First he spoke about, or rather killed the leader Ayatollah was killed. Then he says that the conflict needs to be resolved through diplomatic means. Can this rationality actually be some kind of advantage in negotiations? It is hard for me to judge this. What the current administration is doing on the foreign policy arena, of course, does not fit into any international legal frameworks. Donald Trump himself publicly stated, that he is not interested in the norms of international law. He has his own morality and his own instincts. This, as they say, is what we are observing. Venezuela, the kidnapping of the president under the pretext that he, this President Maduro, heads a drug cartel. As soon as he was kidnapped, it immediately became clear, and the Americans did not hide it, that it was about oil, that they announced that now Venezuela's oil industry is managed, essentially with the participation of Americans. Well, and Iran was declared a sponsor of terrorism. Therefore it had to be destroyed as a civilization, and much more. Little of this works out. Now clouds are gathering around Cuba. The Americans are also actively thinking about this, and I do not exclude that before the midterm elections to Congress in November of this year, there may be further highly dangerous moves on the part of Washington in an effort to prove the success of the Republican administration's actions. That would be regrettable. We, I repeat once more, are ready for dialogue. We appreciate that unlike all other Western countries, with the exception of Hungary until recently, and Slovakia, maybe the US was the only one ready for dialogue. The US was the only one that recognized the need to eliminate the root cause of the Ukrainian crisis, Russia's security problems through dragging Ukraine into NATO. And the need to recognize the realities that have developed on the ground following the referendums in the southeast of Ukraine. But so far, no focus is visible on the part of the US to consolidate these approaches of theirs, especially since they are supported by us, with the participation of Ukraine already, and to convince Europe not to interfere. This is now probably the most serious problem, because Europe wants, like the tail wags the dog, but it's hard to say here who is the tail, though probably after all the United States are the leaders of the Western world. No one denies this, and Europe wants to, if not completely control, then to a significant extent, direct the actions of this leader. Still, clouds are also gathering over the near abroad. Will it become the far abroad for us, taking into account all these aggressive anti-Russian actions of the West? Why are clouds gathering? Over the near abroad, first Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, now already Armenia too. Who will be next? Over the near abroad, first Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, now already Armenia too. Who will be next? The West has never hidden that it wants to deprive our neighbors of the advantages of cooperation with Russia, and wants them to pay the price of that adventure which the West has always nurtured and continues to nurture, meaning the suppression of Russia, or even better, the dismemberment of Russia. These thoughts began to rotate especially actively in the heads of the Western elites after the Soviet Union disappeared, and the Commonwealth of Independent States was formed, along with other structures, subsequently the Eurasian Economic Union, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And the West did start almost immediately. Back in the 90s, it started with Ukraine, remembering perfectly well the precepts of Zbigniew Brzezinski that Russia with Ukraine, when they are together, is indeed a mighty force. But Russia without Ukraine is just a medium-sized power. Well, I leave these comparisons to his conscience, but the fact that Ukraine has always been the most sensitive place for the West in terms of pressure on Russia is a fact. And when the first Maidan happened in 2004, at that time Yanukovych won, and after the second round he won. But the West did everything so that the Supreme Court of Ukraine, or rather the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, made a decision to hold a third round of voting, even though the Constitution says two. And the Constitutional Court, by its decision under pressure from the West, violated the constitution of its country. And the third round was organized in such a way that Yushchenko, the henchman of the West, he won. And we all know what happened next. But in this year of 2004, before the third round, there was no Crimea yet. We had no problems. The West simply wanted to bring its man to power in Ukraine. It had nothing to present to us. Ukraine was a member of the CIS. We traded. We had a free trade zone. But in 2004, European leaders, including, I remember perfectly well, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belgium, probably what was on everyone's mind slipped from his tongue. Before the third round they were broadcasting, Ukrainians are obliged to make a choice. Either they are with Europe or they are with Russia. This either-or mentality, it never disappeared from wise Western heads. And as I say, 22 years ago, when no clouds seemed to be gathering yet. Therefore, what happened next we know. Before the second Maidan, the cause of the second Maidan already in 2013, which began and ended with a coup d'etat in February 2014, the cause again was the European Union, which demanded that Ukraine make a choice, either with us or with Russia. When they were being dragged into the EU, we simply explained to our Ukrainian neighbors that if you become an associate member, that was the first step, you will have obligations on tariffs and on other trade issues that contradict the free trade zone within the framework of the CIS, and goods entering you duty-free from Europe will penetrate into our territory, which raises objections from us, because on many of these goods we have tariff protection. And we simply explained that the European Union, Ukraine, and we need to meet and discuss how to get out of this situation. The then head of the European Commission, Mr. Barroso, stated that it is none of Russia's business to stick its nose into relations between Europe and Ukraine, because the European Union does not meddle into our relations with some Canada or with someone else out there. This was all on this collision course, either or, either with us or against us, and all of this remains to this day. Europe will not support any settlement that will somehow remove the Nazi regime of Zelensky, or whoever might replace him in the future, from under its control. Therefore, yes, and Georgia. The same attempt was made, a completely obvious, flagrant attempt to tear Georgia away from Russia. People went there. Condoleezza Rice went there. Other representatives of the United States. Shortly before the war in South Ossetia in March, I think, or in April of 2008, There was a Russia-NATO summit in Bucharest, and there, separately at the NATO summit, a decision was made which read, Ukraine and Georgia will be in NATO. When President Putin, already at the Russia-NATO meeting, asked, "Why did you do this?" there were some incoherent explanations, and it is absolutely clear that afterwards Mr. Saakashvili, as our people say, lost his mind. He decided that everything was permitted to him since he would be in NATO, and he sanctioned the aggression in South Ossetia, including the attack on Russian peacekeepers, and, of course, including the numerous casualties among the civilian population that this aggression brought in its wake. There was a special commission of the European Union which confirmed that he started this war, but for all the rest, I don't know, those who still accuse us of occupying South Ossetia and Abkhazia, well, it's like water off a duck's back. No one wants to listen. All of this has already been cancelled, just as they accuse us of annexing Crimea in 2014, whereas we back then, talking to Europe, drew their attention to the fact that this was preceded by a coup d'etat, and the putschists immediately declared their intention straight on the second day of their intention to abolish the status of the Russian language, sent armed militants to storm the Supreme Council of Crimea. And in response to this, the Crimeans held a referendum. This concerns no one. This part of history is cancelled. Everything started with the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation in the eyes of the Europeans. Just as there was no attack on South Ossetia, Russia simply occupied a part of Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. They still proceed from this. And yes, they want the current Georgian leadership. These are pragmatists. They do confirm their course toward the European Union, but then they will have to stop being a country that is gloriously famous for its agricultural products. Any agricultural country that joined precisely during the second or third wave of EU expansion, it lost its agriculture because there are masters there who have their own agriculture, their own peasants, their own interests. For Georgia right now, 70% of trade goes between Georgia and Russia and other CIS countries, and very significant shares with China and other countries. So this will all be put under a big question mark if Georgia joins the European Union, knowing what requirements are put forward by Brussels to recruits. Not to mention the requirement to join the sanctions against Russia. The requirement to recognize all foreign policy actions of the European Commission. And so on. I consider that right now pragmatists in Georgia, as I have already said, it is in their interests. By and large, our relations are maintained on a regular basis. Russian tourists love to go there and enjoy Georgian nature and Georgian hospitality. And now neighboring Armenia is also undergoing a trial by this European Union cliché, either or, choose for yourselves. And President Putin spoke very in detail on this topic, and at the press conference on May 9th, Armenia must decide for itself, must make the choice itself whether it wants to remain in the Eurasian Economic Union or join the European Union. We will respect any Armenian choice. But let this choice be made. When Armenian leaders, take Vice Prime Minister Meher Grigoryan, says, "We will announce a referendum only when the question is put squarely." And what does that mean? Mr. Pashinyan, yesterday or the day before yesterday, when he was carrying out an election campaign, when he was releasing a dove, he said that I cannot force Armenia to go here or there. I am obliged to provide an alternative, and my people will decide. But I am showing the alternatives. Well, if that is so, then it is probably necessary to show these alternatives and announce a referendum, because if Yerevan proceeds from what one of the leaders said recently, If they proceed from the fact that we will announce a referendum only when a final answer needs to be given to the European Union, well, that is not entirely democratic, I would say. A law has already been adopted on starting the accession, the official movement into the European Union. If such a law exists, it means you yourself have already put the question squarely. But then let's be responsible for our words and turn to the people.